She enters the relationship like walking into an art gallery at midnight. Everything pristine, everything promising transformation. The walls are white, the lighting perfect, and she believes this time will be different. This time, she won't lose herself. But love, as Schopenhauer knew, is the will's cruelest trick, a biological imperative dressed in poetry, convincing us that our salvation lies in another person's hands. The gallery has mirrors everywhere, each one reflecting a different version of who she could become for him. In the first mirror, she sees herself laughing at his jokes that aren't funny. In the second, she's wearing clothes that feel like costumes. In the third, she's nodding enthusiastically at opinions that make her skin crawl. With each reflection, she steps deeper into the gallery, leaving pieces of her authentic self scattered on the marble floor like discarded admission tickets. The man she loves walks beside her, oblivious to the massacre of identity happening in real time. He falls in love with mirror self number 7, the one who loves hiking, never complains, and finds his ex-girlfriend's stories charming. Meanwhile, her real self is locked in the gallery's basement, pounding on the ceiling, screaming to be let out. Months pass, the relationship deepens, but something sinister happens in the basement. Her abandoned, authentic self doesn't die. It grows stronger, angrier, more resentful. It starts planning its revenge. It begins collecting evidence. Every time she bit her tongue, every genuine desire she suppressed, every moment she chose his comfort over her truth. The basement fills with receipts of betrayal. Not his betrayal of her, but her betrayal of herself. Then comes the night when mirror self number 7 finally cracks. Maybe he makes one too many dismissive comments about her real interest. Maybe she catches herself mid-laugh at another unfunny joke and hears the hollow sound echoing back from the gallery walls. In that moment, her basement self breaks through the floor like a vengeful ghost, and she explodes with years of suppressed fury. "You never knew me!" she screams, hurling accusations like grenades. But the cruelest truth emerges in the aftermath. She never let him know her. She curated his love, managed his affection, and then resented him for loving the performance instead of the performer. The ancients called it possession by false spirits. Today, psychology names it the false self syndrome, a concept crystallized by Donald Winnicott, describing how we construct elaborate personas to earn love, only to feel profoundly unseen when we succeed. Schopenhauer would recognize this as the will's masterpiece of suffering. We create the very conditions for our own heartbreak, then blame others for the cage we built with our own hands. The betrayal isn't his failure to love her authentic self. It's her refusal to risk being authentic in the first place. This is the savage law Nietzsche glimpsed, but never fully articulated. Desire doesn't end in betrayal because the other person fails us. Desire ends in betrayal because we betray ourselves first, creating a love built on deception, then rage against the inevitable collapse of our own lies. What mask are you wearing in your most intimate relationships? And what would happen if you let the person in your basement finally speak? The gallery never forgets what you abandoned to be loved, and neither does the part of you still trapped inside. She builds walls to keep pain out, then wonders why love can't find its way in. But what if the architect and the prisoner were always the same person? Every woman carries blueprints inherited from her first heartbreak. Not romantic love, but the moment she learned that being vulnerable meant being hurt. Maybe it was her father's absent gaze, her mother's conditional affection, or the playground cruelty that taught her that openness equals injury. From that moment, She becomes an architect of emotional fortifications. She designs her defenses with the precision of a military engineer. Sarcasm becomes her moat, deep, wide, impossible to cross without getting wet. Independence becomes her watchtower. She can see potential threats from miles away. Control becomes her drawbridge. Raised at the first sign of genuine intimacy, she tells herself she's building a castle, but what she's actually constructing is a prison with herself as both warden and inmate. As Schopenhauer observed, we suffer more in imagination than reality, and nowhere is this truer than in love. She creates elaborate scenarios of future betrayal, then acts on them hating as if they're already fact. The man who loves her stands outside her fortress, holding flowers that wilt in his hands. He calls up to her window, but she's 3 floors up behind bulletproof glass, making calculations about his motives. When he tries to climb closer, she sees invasion, not devotion. When he steps back to give her space, she sees abandonment, not respect. Every gesture becomes evidence for the case she's already decided, that he will hurt her, so she must hurt him first. The cruelest part isn't the walls themselves. It's what happens when someone actually loves her enough to scale them. When he somehow finds a way through her defenses, when he sits with her in the inner sanctum of her heart, she panics. Because if he can get in, so can pain. If he can reach her, so can rejection, abandonment, betrayal. In that moment of ultimate vulnerability, she does the unthinkable. She opens the gates herself and pushes him out. But here's where the savagery reveals itself. She pushes him out, then blames him for leaving. She constructs the entire architecture of rejection, then experiences genuine shock when she finds herself alone, standing in her impenetrable fortress, surrounded by the rubble of another relationship. She whispers the lie that keeps the cycle alive. I knew he would leave. They always do. The ghost of her abandoned, authentic self appears, holding the original blueprints, the ones drawn by a little girl who just wanted to be loved without conditions. You built this, the ghost says, gesturing to the walls. Every stone, every barrier, every reason he couldn't stay. And you built it so well that even you forgot there was a door. The concept Jung called projection reaches its apex here. We unconsciously assign our own fears and wounds to others, then react to them as if they originated externally. Originally observed by Freud and refined by Jung, projection manifests today in our dating apps where we swipe past love because someone looks like a player, in our relationships where we preemptively end things because it was never going to work anyway, in our beds where we lie awake creating elaborate stories about our partner's secret thoughts. Schopenhauer would see this as the will's most sophisticated trap. We create the very suffering we're trying to avoid, then blame the world for our self-constructed misery. In mythology, it was called the curse of Cassandra, to see the future but be powerless to change it. In you, it's the habit of sabotaging love before it can sabotage you. What walls have you built so high that even you can't see over them anymore? And who are you keeping out? Them, or the part of yourself that still believes in love? The architect always knows where she hid the door. The question is whether she remembers why she locked it. She sells pieces of her soul at market price, then can't understand and why the buyer feels cheated. But in the auction house of modern love, who is the seller and who is the sold? The bidding opens at midnight in the cathedral of her bedroom. She's arranged herself like a commodity, sheets precisely rumpled, lighting dim to golden hour perfection, her body positioned to catch shadows in all the right places. Tonight, like every night, she's auctioning off her worthiness in exchange for temporary validation. "Do I hear 5 compliments?" she whispers to the darkness, offering her carefully curated vulnerability. "How about 3 orgasms and a morning text?" The invisible auctioneer, her own desperate need, keeps raising the stakes. Soon, she's bidding parts of herself she didn't know were for sale. Her boundaries for his comfort, her opinions for his approval, her future plans for his convenience. Schopenhauer warned that sexual desire is the will's most elaborate deception, promising individual satisfaction while serving only the species' continuation. But modern women have perfected an even crueler variation, using sex not to perpetuate life, but to temporarily silence the voice that whispers they're not enough. She becomes a master appraiser of male attention, able to calculate the exact exchange rate between flesh and affection. A night of perfect performance equals approximately 3 days of feeling chosen. A week of sexual availability might buy her a month of relationship security. She develops a sophisticated understanding of depreciation, how quickly her value drops if she shows need, displays emotion, or God forbid, asks for reciprocity. The men move through her bedroom like art collectors at a gallery opening, sampling her offerings with the detached expertise of connoisseurs. Some appreciate her technique, others her enthusiasm. A few even compliment her aesthetic presentation. But none of them see the price tags hanging from her soul, the small pieces of dignity she shaves off with each transaction. The most insidious part isn't the selling, it's the buying. She starts purchasing her own lie, convincing herself that this commerce is empowerment, that sexual agency means treating her body like a store and her emotions like inventory to be managed. She tells herself she's in control, that she's using them as much as they're using her. But late at night, after the customer has left, she counts the receipts and realizes she's been selling at a loss for years. Then comes the inevitable crash. Maybe it's the man who ghosts after she gave him everything she thought he wanted. Maybe it's the morning she wakes up feeling more empty after sex than before. Maybe it's the moment she realizes she's forgotten how to be intimate without performing, how to be desired without degrading herself, how to receive love without calculating its cost. Standing naked in her bedroom turned marketplace, surrounded by the debris of transactions that never made her feel whole, she finally sees the con. She was never the seller. She was always the product. And the buyer? Her own wounded psyche, desperately trying to purchase worthiness from strangers who were never authorized to sell it. This is what psychologists term sexual compulsivity, not an addiction to sex, but an addiction to the temporary relief from shame that sexual validation provides. First studied extensively by Patrick Carnes, it manifests today in our hookup culture, our social media thirst traps, our dating apps, where we swipe for ego boosts rather than connection. Schopenhauer would recognize this as the will's most sophisticated slavery. We become convinced we're choosing our chains, even as we forge them stronger with each supposed act of liberation. The ancients called it sacred prostitution, the trading of body for divine favor. In you, it's the habit of confusing sexual attention with spiritual worthiness. How many pieces of yourself have you sold to feel temporarily valuable? And what would happen if you declared bankruptcy on the whole system? The auction house never closes, but the auctioneer can always refuse to sell. She rehearses perfection in front of an audience of ghosts, then wonders why the applause sounds hollow. But what if the critic she's trying to please died years ago and she never got the memo? The theater lights never dim in the playhouse of her psyche. Act 1 began in childhood, when she learned that love was a performance review and approval was a standing ovation she had to earn nightly. Now, decades later, she's still on stage, still auditioning for a part she's never quite good enough to get. The invisible audience fills every seat of her consciousness. Her mother's disapproving frown from row 3, her ex-boyfriend's bored sigh from the balcony, her colleagues' whispered judgments from the orchestra pit. She can feel their eyes tracking her every gesture, scoring her every choice. The pressure is so constant, she's forgotten what it feels like to exist without an audience. Every morning, she applies her makeup like war paint, choosing her costume with the strategic precision of a method actor. Today's role, successful woman who has it all together. She rehearses her lines in the mirror, casual responses to questions about her love life, practiced enthusiasm for career achievements that feel empty, sophisticated laughter for conversations that bore her. By the time she leaves the house, she's so deep in character that she's forgotten who she was before the curtain rose. Schopenhauer understood that we are all actors on the stage of the will, playing parts we never auditioned for. But some women perfect this performance so completely that they lose the ability to distinguish between the actress and the role. The most exhausting scenes are the romantic ones. Every date becomes opening night. Every relationship a long-running production where she's simultaneously the lead actress, the director, and the harshest critic. She analyzes her performance obsessively. Did she laugh too loud at his joke? Was she too eager when she texted back? Did her vulnerability read as authentic or desperate? The reviews in her head are always mixed, always demanding better, always threatening to close the show. But here's the tragedy hidden in the comedy. The audience she's performing for exists largely in her imagination. Her mother hasn't cared about her life choices for years. Her ex-boyfriend has forgotten she exists. Her colleagues are too busy worrying about their own performances to scrutinize hers. She's been giving Tony award-worthy performances to an empty theater, pouring her life force into pleasing people who stopped watching long ago. The breakdown comes during what should be her greatest triumph. Maybe she gets the promotion, the relationship, the recognition she's been performing for. But instead of satisfaction, she feels nothing. Because the woman accepting the applause isn't really her. It's the character she's been playing so long that she's lost access to her authentic self, standing center stage in the spotlight she's always craved. She realizes with horror that she doesn't know who she is when no one's watching. The ghost of her child self appears in the wings, still wearing the costume from her very first performance. The little girl who sang and danced not for applause, but for the pure joy of expression. When did you forget, the ghost asks, that the theater was supposed to be fun? This is what psychologists call the imposter syndrome, a term coined by Pauline Rose Clance and Suzanne Eames, describing the persistent feeling that one's successes are undeserved and that exposure as a fraud is imminent. It manifests today in our curated social media lives, our networking events where authenticity feels dangerous, our relationships where we fear that showing our true selves will result in abandonment. Schopenhauer would see this as the will's cruelest theater. We become so devoted to playing the part we think others want that we lose the very self we were trying to protect. The Greeks called it persona, the mask actors wore to amplify their voices. In you, it's the mask you can't remove because you've forgotten there's a face underneath. What role have you been playing so long that you've forgotten it's just a character? And what would happen if you walked off stage in the middle of the performance? The theater of the mind runs 24/7, but the lead actress can always choose to go off script. She curates a private collection of perfect endings that never happened, then charges admission to a life she's never lived. But what if the curator and the ghost were always the same person? In the abandoned wing of her heart sits a museum that no one else is allowed to visit. Here, behind glass cases and velvet ropes, she's preserved every relationship that could have been, every love that almost was, every perfect moment that exists only in the conditional tense. The placard reads, "If only, a retrospective of alternative realities." The centerpiece of the collection is her first love, preserved exactly as he was at 19, before life carved lines into his face, before disappointment taught him to lower his expectations, before she learned that intensity and sustainability rarely coexist. In her museum, he remains forever poised on the verge of becoming the man who would have understood her completely. She's assigned him the role of the one who got away, though the truth is more complex. He got away from an idea of himself that may never have existed. Schopenhauer observed that we suffer more from the pain we imagine than the pain we actually experience. But in matters of love, women have perfected the inverse, suffering more from the happiness we imagine than the happiness we actually experience. Adjacent exhibits showcase the other residents of her alternative reality, the colleague who smiled at her in exactly the right way, frozen at the moment before she discovered he was married, the stranger from the coffee shop, preserved in his state of infinite possibility before she learned his name and found him ordinary, the friend who almost kissed her one night, immortalized in the amber of what if before they both stepped back into the safety of the friend zone. She walks through these halls daily, a curator of her own disappointments, adding new pieces to the collection while polishing the old ones until they gleam with impossible perfection. Each exhibit comes with its own elaborate backstory, how this man would have loved her differently, how that relationship would have unfolded without the complications that destroyed all the others, how she would have been a different woman, braver, softer, more worthy of devotion, in the arms of someone who saw her completely. But the most insidious exhibit is the one marked present tense, conditional mood. Here she displays her current relationship as it could be if only he were different, if only she were different, if only the timing were different, if only the universe would rearrange itself according to her specifications. She spends more time in this imaginary version of her love than in the actual relationship itself, polishing the fantasy while the reality tarnishes from neglect. The cruelest revelation comes when she finally brings someone to her secret museum. In a moment of vulnerability, she shares her collection of what-ifs with the man she's currently dating, expecting him to understand the depth of her romantic capacity. Instead, he sees what she cannot: a mausoleum of excuses for why nothing is ever enough, a shrine to the impossible standards that guarantee perpetual dissatisfaction, a gallery where she's both the artist and the art, creating elaborate justifications for why love always falls short of her imagination. "You've built a beautiful prison," he tells her, looking around at her carefully curated impossibilities. "But the woman in these paintings, she's not real, and the men you've preserved, they were never real either. You've fallen in love with ghosts, and now you expect the living to compete with the dead." Standing alone among her exhibits after he leaves, she finally understands the museum's true purpose. It wasn't built to honor great loves, but to ensure that no real love could ever measure up to the fantasy. Every relationship has been doomed to disappoint, not because the men weren't good enough, but because she'd already decided that reality couldn't compete with possibility. This is what psychologists term fantasy bond, a concept developed by Robert Firestone, describing how we substitute imaginary relationships for real ones, finding it safer to love the idea of someone than to risk loving the actual person. It manifests today in our dating apps, where we fall in love with profiles before meeting humans, in our long-distance relationships that thrive on absence, in our tendency to romanticize exes only after they're gone. Schopenhauer would recognize this as the will's most sophisticated trap. We create suffering by comparing reality to imagination, then blame reality for losing a contest it was never designed to win. The ancients called it living among the shades, loving the dead more than the living. In you, it's the habit of loving what never was more than what is. What impossible standards are you using to measure real love? And what would happen if you closed the museum and moved into the messiness of the present? The museum of what never was charges no admission, but costs everything. The curator always has the power to turn off the lights and lock the door. Here, at the end of all 5 fables, we arrive at Nietzsche's savage law in its full, terrible clarity. Desire doesn't end in betrayal because others fail us. Desire ends in betrayal because we have perfected the art of failing ourselves. We construct elaborate systems, false selves, emotional prisons, transactional intimacy, performative authenticity, impossible standards that guarantee our own heartbreak, then blame love itself for the architecture of our disappointment. The woman who rages against men for never truly knowing her has spent years ensuring they cannot. The woman who builds walls against pain has built them so high that love cannot scale them. The woman who sells herself for validation has commodified the very thing that could make her whole. The woman who performs perfection has forgotten the person she was before the curtain rose. The woman who loves impossibility has made it impossible to be loved. This is the core of female love's relationship with betrayal. It is not that women are more prone to being betrayed, but that they have become masters of self-betrayal, experts in creating the very conditions for their own abandonment. The tragic irony is that in trying to protect themselves from the pain of authentic love, they guarantee the deeper pain of perpetual disconnection. But here, in this recognition, lies the possibility of liberation. For if we are the architects of our own emotional prisons, we are also the ones who hold the keys. The savage law contains its own reversal. The same creative power we use to construct our cages can be redirected toward building genuine intimacy. The same intelligence we use to sabotage love can be employed to sustain it. The choice, as always, is ours. We can continue to be the authors of our own heartbreak, or we can learn to write a different story, one where authenticity is risked, walls are lowered, intimacy is honored rather than commercialized, performance gives way to presence, and reality is embraced over fantasy. Nietzsche's savage law is not a condemnation. It is an invitation to consciousness, a challenge to reclaim the power we have unconsciously surrendered to our own fears. For in the end, the betrayal is not final until we choose to make it so. And the choosing always begins now.